Good morning, dear friends, dear comrades. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak to you today, not just to commemorate all these victims of Serbian people during the NATO aggression, but also to take a view into the future, for a better future. From the age of the war to the age of the peace, neutrality and solidarity-based sovereignty as a concept for the future. Dear comrades, dear friends of peace, in the German-speaking EU area, the German Chancellor Scholz coined a term 2 years ago, turning point, Zeitenwende in German. He said that war has returned to Europe in 2022. International law is being broken and the principle of territorial integrity and the UN Charter are being violated. This new imperialism could not be tolerated. The term turning point has now become a political and media narrative that must be accepted without any contradiction. This turning point narrative is currently being used in EU Europe to argue for the biggest armament, war mobilization and redistribution of public funds from social welfare to the military-industrial complex since many decades. We supposedly have to defend ourselves against the evil of the East. The logic of war has replaced diplomacy and peace initiatives. Despite the danger of stigmatization and canceling, there are many courageous and critical people who refuse to accept this narrative. As we commemorate the victims of the NATO aggression against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, 25 years ago, so today in Belgrade, we must remember this term, turning point. After the end of the Cold War and the end of systemic competition, some people meant well and believed in a so-called cooperative common European home, as Gorbachev said, and the peace dividend. However, this was not what the capitalist victors wanted. It was all about extending their own political, military, economic and cultural power over the vanquished, just as it is inherent to imperialism. According to neoliberal theorist Francis Fukuyama, the whole world should now submit to liberal capitalism. We have reached the end of the history. There will never again be an alternative to globalized capitalism and the unipolar Western supremacy. And to achieve this, the Yugoslavian model of independent development in Europe has also had to be abolished. Collective ownership, sovereignty, and non-alignment should no longer exist in the so-called New Europe. The history of the years-long destruction of socialist Yugoslavia, from the outside and inside, with the many deaths of all peoples, is evident. It culminated in the brutal NATO aggression against the then small Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999. An imperial war of reorganization of Europe was waged under the pretext of enforcing human rights. Resistance to the neoliberal expansion after 1989 was not allowed from the point of view of the ruling Western elites. In this process, those Western powers that today like to invoke these principles broke international law and the UN Charter, violated territorial integrity and unilaterally shifted borders, Serbia, Kosovo, and ignored the fundamental human right, namely the right to peace. This has permanently weakened and damaged the international security order. We can therefore conclude that Yugoslavia was the precedent. The so-called turning point was on 24th of March 1999, when the most powerful military alliance in the world, NATO, attacked a small sovereign country in the heart of Europe without a UN mandate for 78 days. The first war with German participation since 1945. The case of Yugoslavia was a door opener for an era of wars from Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, etc., today in Ukraine. In all these cases, international law and human rights were violated by a wide variety of actors. The unipolar world reordering and so-called rule-based order was become a dystopian world disorder. A major war in Europe is no longer out of the question. Warmongering and escalation are bringing us to the brink of a third world war. We are currently observing major changes and ruptures in the world. On the one hand, the West, above all the European Union, is increasingly isolating itself from the rest of the world through sanctionism and the policy of double standards. At the same time, the self-confidence of the countries of the global South, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, which no longer support this policy of double standards, hypocrisy, Western self-aggrandizement, and one-sided trade agreements, has been growing for years. African states are emancipating themselves from their former colonial masters and seeking new alliances. The People's Republic of China has not only become a driver of the global economy, but is also gradually developing into an independent political pole. Russia is currently decoupling itself economically and politically from the West and turning towards the People's Republic of China. The conflict between the People's Republic of China and the USA in the Pacific has the potential for another major military conflict. The PRC will not accept an end to the one China policy by the West in accordance with international law. With India, South Africa, and Brazil, there are countries in the Southern Hemisphere that are articulating their national, but above all their common economic and political interests more strongly than ever in the global political stage, including within the framework of the BRICS. These are the first steps towards a multipolarization of the world. For that global reason, and due to the situation in Ukraine, the EU elites now want to establish the European Union more strongly as an independent imperial military player. The current alliance with the interests of US imperialism could be ended by the change coordinated with a change in US leadership's elites. Direct military involvement in Ukraine by EU countries coordinated with NATO is not long out of question, as French President Macron has announced. We need a strong peace movement in Europe and the US to exert pressure for an end to the current conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. We Austrians, we have learned our lessons from two devastating world wars and Nazi fascism. A large majority of the population, about 70 to 80% of Austrians, stand firmly behind the country's neutrality and does not want Austria to be involved in war. Joining NATO is rejected, as it is participation in a so-called EU army. Austria's neutrality was severely restricted by its accession to the EU in 1995. It continues to be constitutional law, but is overwritten by the so-called common foreign and security policy of the European Union. The international recognized independent foreign and peace policy based on neutrality, which was shaped by the socialist chancellor Bruno Kreisky in the 70s and 80s, no longer exists since EU accession. The only truly neutral country in Europe nowadays, militarily, politically, and economically, is currently Serbia. This is why the country is under so much pressure. Military blocs divide, neutrality unites, particularly in times of new confrontations and wars. The concept of neutrality is a promising concept for the future, especially for small states. However, neutrality must be understood and practiced comprehensively. That means militarily, politically, and also economically. For Austria, that means that it must regain more sovereignty from the European Union. Sovereignty and neutral self-determination do not mean isolation, but the self-empowerment to act as a bridge and mediator between poles, power centers, and not to be drawn into wars itself. Sovereignty is also a prerequisite for the reorganization of social relations within the states. The neoliberal EU treaties and the fiscal policy corset restrict the welfare state and de facto disempower national budget policy and thus democracy, as the example of Greece in particular drastically demonstrated. Instead of a centralized European Union which serves the interests of transnational capitalists and armament monopolies, we need an alliance of sovereign, cooperative, and solidary democracies. Sovereignization, strengthening the rights of the working class, pushing back capitalism, deglobalization, and expanding the social state must go hand in hand. Neutral states in particular can and should make their contribution to a new, just, and equitable peace order due to their non-alignment status. A world order that is built on the basis of equal rights and obligations, to which also all major states, including the USA and Russia, must submit. Multipolarity is a necessary step towards a polyphony of independent, solidary, and equal nations. Let us fight together for an age of peace. Poštovani drugovi, dragi prijatelji, dozvolite mi da govorim posljednje rečenice na srpskom. Na jeziku koji volim, kao što poštujem i srpsku kulturu i srpsku istoriju. Ta istorija predstavlja borbu za slobodu, nezavisnost i ravnopravnost. Đorđe Petrović, Milunka Savić, Mladen Stojanović, Boško Puha, Lepa Radić, Sanja Milenković i Milica Rakić sinonim su za ovu borbu i njene žrtve. Ne smemo ih zaboraviti, nikada. Ja dobro znam, srpski narod još uvijek ima u sebi taj duh slobode. Molim vas, sačuvajte to. U ime žrtava NATO agresije nastavljamo da se borimo za pravo i pravdu, nema predaje. Živelo prijateljstvo naroda, živio mir, dole imperializam, slobodno narodu.